How you doing there? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Ches, Daf 108 of Masechta Menachos. Friends, we are mamish, getting close to the end. Today is, what's today? Wednesday. Okay, wow, Wednesday. These weeks, they just fly by. But we're just learning, doing our thing. Anyway, so if today's Wednesday, it means, God willing, on Friday, we should be wrapping up the unbelievable Masechta Menachos. Friends, on today's daf, okay, the first half of today's daf, I have a feeling it's going to be a long one today. That's my feeling. Anyways, the first part of today's daf, we're talking about the 6 shofars on the Temple Mount. Well, there were really, of course, 13 shofars, pushkas, on the Temple Mount. 6 of them were for nedavahs, were for purchasing olas, the olas, ketzam, mizbeachs. We're going to see a machlokes involving, I think, 5 different opinions of what those 6 shofars were. 6 times 5 is 30. That's going to be a lot of stuff to explain. There is some overlap, but there's going to be a lot of stuff to explain. Some of it's going to be interesting. Some of it is going to be a little elusive. So that's going to be really the first half of today's daf, is explaining those 6 shofars on the 6 nedavah shofars on Har HaBayis, what their purpose was. It should be interesting, but somewhat technical. Next, then we get to a new Mishnah where we discuss options when a nedavah becomes blemished. Okay, of course we know the difference between a neder and a nedavah. A neder is when you say, I'm going to bring a korban. A nedavah is when you say, this animal is a korban. As we know from the Mishnah and Masechta Megillah, the difference is whether or not you are chayiv ba'achrayis. By a nedavah, if you say, this animal is going to be a korban, if something happens to that animal, well, the animal's gone, the obligation is gone. So what happens if the animal gets a mum, and you want to now bring a new korban? What are the options that you have there? And we'll get to another Mishnah at the end of the daf, which discusses designating an animal from a group of animals. So if you have, let's say, a few cows, and you say, I am going to bring a cow, so which cow are you going to be bringing? That type of stuff. So friends, very kodshim, menachasi kind of a daf. There should be some interesting stuff to walk away with, friends. There should be, I think, some interesting stuff to walk away with. Anyways, friends, here we go. We're going to jump into this great daf of Daf Ches, Daf 108 of Masechta Menachos. Come, join me. Let's enjoy ourselves. Have a great time. All right, friends. We begin on Daf Zayin Amid Beis, about 8 or so lines from the bottom of Daf Zayin Amid Beis. Tanan Asum. We learn in a Mishnah Masechta Shkalim, Shisha Linedava. Givaldig. We learn in Masechta Shkalim. This Mishnah has been coming up, I think, quite a bit, has it not, friends? The 13 pushkas that were on Har HaBayis. That on Har HaBayis there were 13 pushkas, 13 donation boxes that you can put money into. Now, 7 of them were for different things, which we'll get into a little bit later, very slightly later. But for example, one of them was for machatzis hashekels. Another one was for your machatzis hashekel from last year. If you didn't donate last year, that's 2 of the pushkas. We're going to not really talk too much about those 7, right? So basically, 7 of those pushkas, we were collecting money for something, okay? Something like the machatzis hashekel, like I just mentioned, or maybe if you needed to bring birds, okay, fine. Yeah, we'll talk about that a little bit. But you're right, or if you could donate money for the zav of the kaporis, or anyways, fine. There were different things that you could give money towards. Now, there were another 6 pushkas, 6 donation boxes that were specifically for olas ketzam mizbeach. I think I see them written both ways. I think you should say ketzam mizbeach. Now, what those were we're going to, all these things that I'm saying now, they're also going to come up in the Gemara, so we're going to flesh them out more. But basically, what they were, as we're familiar, this is a concept that comes up from time to time. But essentially, in the Beis HaMikdash, when there was no other korbanos to be burnt at the moment on the Mizbeach, so they would just keep a constant flow of olas being offered on the Mizbeach. Those were called the olas kayetz HaMizbeach. We're going to talk a little bit more about them soon. So there were 6 of these donation boxes, that the money collected in those donation boxes all went towards the Olas Kayetz Mizbeach for these korbanos that would be offered when there were no other korbanos to be offered. And the question is, why do you need 6? Can't you just have 1? So we're going to have 5 different opinions, if I'm not mistaken. I think it's 5 different opinions about what the purpose of these 6 nedavahs were, rather than just having 1. What the purpose of these 6 pushkas were. So keneged me, what do they represent? Opinion number 1. Amar Chizkiah keneged shisha batei uvis hakayanim shetiknu lahem chachamim kidei sheyeh shulim zeh im zeh. Of course, as we know from the Mishnah in the last parak of Masechta Tainis, Kohanim, Levim, and Yisraelim were divided up into 24 groups, which were called Mishmaros and Ma'amados. Now, when it came to so there were 24 mishmars of Kohanim. And every week, there would be a different, essentially, there would be a different mishmar that was working in the temple that week. There was like, so of the 24, the regalim, everybody worked, whatever, but on a standard week. This week, what's this week? Standard week this week, I think. So this week, there would be one of the 24 mishmars would be working in the Beis HaMikdash. Now, the mishmars were then further divided into 6 groups to represent Sunday through Friday, and then Shabbos, everybody would have the opportunity to do whatever avodah there was in the Beis HaMikdash on Shabbos. So there would be the mishmar was further divided into 6 groups, which were called Batei Avos, and then there would be a Beis Av for Sunday, a different Beis Av for Monday, Tuesday, etc. Now, here's the thing. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, what was the Olas Kayetz Mizbeach? The Olas Kayetz Mizbeach was when there were no other korbanos to be offered on the Mizbeach. So let's talk about what would generally be offered on the Mizbeach on a standard day. As far as I am aware, if anybody has any other insight, please, I'd be happy if you shared that. But from what I could tell, basically it was a korban tamid shel shachar. As soon as the sun is shining at Alos HaShachar, or Heir Pnei Mizrach, so they would offer the korban tamid shel shachar. And in the afternoon, they would offer the korban tamid shel bin arbain. What else were they offering? I don't know. If it was Rosh Chodesh, they'd offer korban musaf. Shabbos korban musaf. There wasn't that much going on. Interesting, Shiloh, what did they do on Shabbos? Did they have Olas Kayetz Mizbeachs on Shabbos? What did they do on Shabbos? On Shabbos, there isn't much to offer. It's really just, probably not. That's interesting. I assume, that's an interesting question. What do they do on Shabbos? I assume not, because I think we assume that usually just communal offerings that have a fixed time, those are what's offered on Shabbos. I'd assume that excludes Kayetz Mizbeachs. I'm going to go with no. That's an interesting question. Anyways, so the rest of the week, though, so you'd have the korban tamid shel shachar, korban tamid shel bin arbaim. What else are you offering? Well, neders and nedavahs, right? If people come to the Beis HaMikdash, walk-ins, people come into the Beis HaMikdash with a neder, with a nedavah that they want to offer on the Mizbeach. So the Kohanim who are working in the temple that day will offer the korbanos for people who have neders and nedavahs to offer. What else are they offering? I don't know, nothing. So here's the thing. So basically the shaila is, so now here's another thing. A korban ola, the hides go to the Kohanim. So now, if there was a day that there was more nidarim, there were a lot of people coming. Maybe some days are more popular than other days. It could be that a Sunday maybe, maybe people came to Yerushalayim for Shabbos and then Sunday they want to come to the Beis HaMikdash. I don't know. It could be a Sunday is a more busy day than a Tuesday. So basically, there's a big difference for people. So let's assume that Sundays were a busier day than Tuesday. I don't know if they were or weren't. But let's just say, for example, Sundays were busier days than Tuesdays were. So there's a big difference in terms of the experience of Sunday's Beis Av versus Tuesday's Beis Av. Sunday's Beis Av, since it was busy, there were a lot of people coming in to bring their korbanos. So there were a lot of neders and nedavahs. Maybe the whole day they were busy offering neders and nedavahs, shlomim, zolas, that they didn't actually use they didn't have to use any of the funds to pay for kayetz and offer kayetz mizbeachs on the mizbeach. But what does that mean? Let's compare this with Tuesday, where let's say mamish there was pretty much nobody came to offer any neders and nedavahs. Maybe a few people, but there wasn't much work to do in terms of neders and nedavahs. So they offered a whole bunch of kayetz hamizbeachs, and all of those hides went to that base of that was a big loot. At the end of the day, that base of is walking away with hides of lots of these olas kayetz hamizbeachs. Whereas Sunday's base of was busy with neders and nedavahs. Who knows? Maybe they were all shlomims. I don't know. Or even if they were neders, all right, they could say, well, okay, so what? So it happened to be a lot of people came, but we didn't get to use any of the olas kayetz mizbeachs and take advantage of those hides. Anyways, so this can lead to a little bit of friction between the different base ofs. At the end of the week, they go home. Tuesday's base of, they're all schlepping home their hides. And Sunday's base of is like looking at the Tuesday's base of with watery eyes and being like, come on, that's not fair. So therefore, instead of just having one big collection of money for the base ofs, instead of having just one big collection for all of the kayetz and mizbeach's offerings, there were 6 different pushkas. And each pushke was shaykh to one of the different batei avis, such that, now I don't know exactly how it would work in terms of details, who would be offering and how exactly it worked in terms of who's got what, but the principle was that there would be 6 different pushkes, and therefore that way, each base of would have somehow money that was dedicated to their kayetz hamizbeachs. Again, how that actually worked in practice, because if Sunday's base of was busy all day, then how did they actually get to take advantage of it? I don't know how exactly it worked in practice, but the principle was that this was a way of ensuring that there would be kind of a fair spread of hides for all the batei avos. Maybe on Tuesday, the Tuesday's base of would kind of bring a whole bunch of kayetz hamizbeachs with their money for them, but then maybe they would run out and then they would have to use Sunday's money maybe, and then those hides would go to Sunday. I don't know exactly how it worked, but the idea was that by spreading out and having 6 different pushkas, each base of would be able to, at the end of the week, walk out of the Beis HaMikdash with a whole bunch of hides. Okay, fine. Yeah, a lot to explain there. So Keneged me, Amar Chizkiah, so says Chizkiah, Keneged Shisha Batei Avis, that the 6 pushkas were for the 6 Batei Avis, HaKohanim, Shetiknu Lehem Chachamim, that the Chachamim this established that there should be a dedicated pushke for each base av, kidei sheyesh shalim zem zeh, so that everything should be peaceful and all of the batei avos should feel like they were able to walk away with some good hides. Going to take a shluck of tea and we'll go weiter. Rabbi Yechanan Omer, says Rabbi Yechanan, a little bit simpler. Well, there were a lot, apparently I guess a lot of people were donating money for the kayetz hamizbeach. So there was a lot of money in the being held there in the pushke. So tiknu loim shofars merubin, so they divided into 6 shofars, kadesh leis av shamos, so that the coins don't go moldy, I guess. If there's a lot of coins just held up in one big pushke, so then I guess, I don't know, somehow the coins can start developing some kind of mildew or something on them, I don't know, mold. So by having 6 separate pushkas, that was helpful. Okay, fine. Not familiar with how mold grows and stuff, but apparently that was a solution. Was the Iri Omar says the Iri Keneged. Okay, this is a bit of a tricky opinion, but the Iri Omar Keneged Par ve'egel Ayel ve'keves Gedi v'soyer v'rebihi Damer Kohen. Okay, so this is a little bit tricky because if I understand the concept correctly, it's that if a person says that I'm going to bring a korban ola, right? Let's say a person says I'm going to bring a korban ola to the Beis HaMikdash. I'm going to bring a sheep as a korban ola to the Beis HaMikdash. So you would think he either goes to his flock and he separates the sheep, or he goes to Yerushalayim and buys a sheep and he walks to the Beis HaMikdash with a sheep. I think what Zeiri is saying, and I'll say what the problem with it is, but in principle, I think what Zeiri is saying is, no, you don't have to do that. What you could do is, you go to the Beis HaMikdash with, as we said yesterday, a sheep, let's say, is 2,500 shekels. You take 2,500 shekels to the Beis HaMikdash, you put 2,500 shekels into the pushke, and you go home. And you assume that the Kohanim are going to be offering that, are going to be buying an Ola for and offering your Ola for you. The problem with saying that that's an individual korban is that, first of all, as we learned earlier in the Masechta, you have to do smicha on a korban Ola, and you have to do smicha on your own korban. Nobody else can do it for you. So I don't know. Apparently, as it's talking about, it's a little bit unclear exactly what. So I think it would have to be a communal korban, but I don't know what kind of communal korban they would. Yeah. So I don't know exactly. I mean, Rashi says shamisnade par laola. Somebody who donates a par for an ola, maybe even like, because as we're going to learn later. That's actually how it works when it comes to kinim. For example, you have a yoledes, right? A woman who gives birth, a woman has a baby, whether a boy or a girl. For a boy, this would happen after 40 days. For a girl, it would happen after 80 days. So this woman would come to the Beis Hamikdash and bring a bird chatas and also a sheep for an ola. The thing is, if she can't afford it, then she would just bring a chatas and an ola, 2 birds. So how does that work? She doesn't actually have to buy 2 birds and bring them to the Beis Hamikdash and give the birds. Rather, what she does is, one of the 7 pushkas there was for this purpose, was for kinim, was for these nests. And she could just put money into the pushka for the kinim, for the nests. And she can rest assured that by the end of the day, a Kohen would have, gone into that pushka, taken out all the money that was in there, and used that money to then offer nests for anybody who had put money into the pushka, and she can go home resting assured that her birds have been offered, and she can now eat kachim, she can eat shlamim, whatever it is, right? Because until then, she's not, right? She's a mechuseres kippurim. I don't know if it's she necessarily considered whatever. She had to bring those offerings. Until she brings those offerings, she can't eat kachim. But she can put money in the box and rest assured that her birds have been offered. She put the money in the box will be emptied out, birds will be offered for all, for whatever money has been offered there, including hers. Now, it sounds like Zeiri is saying something similar to that if you need to that if somebody donated a korban ola, whether a cow, whether a calf, whether a ram, whether a sheep, whether a big goat, whether a little goat, you put money in the pushka and it'll get offered. But again, it can't be talking about individuals, so it's a little bit unclear exactly what he's talking about. But that seems to be the concept of Zeiri. Again, I have questions about it, but that seems to be the concept of Zeiri now. And why not just say cows rather than just say 3? Grown cows, rams, and grown sheep. Why do you need the little ones as well? So he said because it's according to Rebbe, who said that if you said you're going to bring a small one, you can't then bring a big one. You have to bring what you committed to bring. And therefore, if somebody was going to donate a calf, so a calf has to be offered, you wouldn't be able to offer a adult cow instead and say, hey, it's an upgrade. No. According to Zeiri, you have to offer whatever you committed to. And therefore, so again, Zeiri Omer says, Zeiri keneged par ve'egel ayil ve'keves gdiv ve'soyer, 6 separate pushkas ve'Rebbe, and it's the opinion of Rebbe Domer who says, ka'in ve'vigadol lo yotza, that if you had committed to a smaller one and brought a larger one, you are not yotze. Fine. Next, uvar para Omer. So I think it's actually a total of 6 options, not 5 options. Uvar para Omer says, bar para keneged aparim ve'aelim ve'akvasim v'asirim ve'mosars ve'ama shish. Okay, and Bar Poda's opinion is Keneged Parim. What's Parim? So there are of course scenarios of Yira Achi Yistoyev V'yimacher V'yavi Damav Linedavah. There are scenarios that we have encountered over the past several years where a animal is left to graze, allowed to get a mum. Once it gets a mum, you sell it, and the money goes for a nedavah for this very purpose. So there was one pushka there for parim. What's the scenario of parim? So this is talking about, for example, parim davar shel tzibur. If you had set aside a cow to be a parim davar shel tzibur and it got lost, so you offered a different one. Now, normally when it comes, now parim davar shel tzibur is a chatas. So now, normally when it comes to a korban chatas, this would be an example of one of the chamisha chatos amesos, chamish chatos amesos, one of the 5 chatos that are left to die, right? Chatos shekipu b'alim ba'acher. However, first of all, not in all cases. Saka machlekes. Sometimes we'll get into that in Tamura. I'm sure we will enjoy ourselves thoroughly in that very intricate sugya. And if we don't, then our souls, our godly souls, certainly will. Now. So that's once. There are scenarios even by Chatash Shekipu by the Ba'acher that you could also have Yirah Shistaiv. However, I looked it up anyways. This would also Chamish Chataos Amesos would seem to be I'm fairly certain based on the Mishnayos and Masechta Tamura that is also specific to individual korbanos. Palam Davar Tzibor is a communal korban. So therefore, this would not be considered one of the Chamesh Chataos Amesos, and therefore, so if you had set aside a cow for the par Ilam Davar Tzibor, it got lost, so you offered a different one instead. Now you find the original, so you let it graze until it gets a mum, and then you sell it, and that money is what we're talking about. That money would go into this pushke for a cow for a nedavah. A ram would be, for example, right. So we have a concept of right, kol shebechatas mesa be'asham yire, that any of the chamesh chatos hamesos, the 5 scenarios whereby chatos it would be left to die. By an asham, you let it get a mum, sell it, and then the money goes to for this purpose for kayitz hamizbeach. So a ram could be a reference to an asham me'ilos, an asham gezelos. Right, in those scenarios, you bring a ram that's 2 years old as an asham, and so again, let's say you set aside a ram and it got lost, so then you offered a different one. So now you would wait for the original one. If you find it, to get a mum, sell it, use the money for kayitz mizbeach. We also then talked about kvasim. Sheep would be a scenario where, for example, a asham mitzara, an asham nazir, those were 1-year-old sheep, and also say it got lost and then you found so it got lost, so you offered a different one, then you found the original one, you wait for it to get a mum, you sell it, and the money goes for olas kayitz mizbeach. That's the kvasim. Seirim would be, for example, the communal korban chatas, the communal the sayir regalim, for the sirei regalim, for example, the goats that were offered as chatas on the shalosh regalim, those were communal offerings, and if they get lost and you offer a different one instead, and then you find the original, so again, wait for it to get a mum, the money would go for the kayitz mizbeach. We then talk about mosaros. So if for example you went to buy a asham ilos, an asham gezelos, asham mitzora, whatever, and you had there was leftover money from right we talked about mosa chatas, mosa asham, right, leftover money. So you went to buy a korban asham, you brought $3,000, you got a bargain, 3,000 shekels, you got a bargain, 2,500 shekels, you had an extra 500 shekels, put it in the mosaros pushke. That would be the 5th pushke. And finally, the ma'ah, also a bit of a tricky and elusive sugya. This has to, there is so much here, right? We've had 4 opinions so far, and each one is like divided into 6. But this is the final one of this batch. This is a little bit of a tricky sugya because this has to do with something called a kalbon. A kolbon when it comes to the machatzis shekel, which is a little bit tricky to understand exactly what it is, but basically by the machatzis shekel every single year, the Yidden had to donate a half shekel to the Beis HaMikdash. The thing is, there was a little bit of a hidden fee, and that is this kolbon. There was a shtickle that was actually added to the machatzis shekel. It's not super clear exactly why, but we'll explain it the way that Rashi explains it. At least Rashi explained. I saw in the article it was explained by the Sfas Emes. None of this stuff is particularly clear. But Al Kopanim, what seems to be going on is that, according to this view, so a machatzis shekel, you wanted to make sure that you're offering at least a machatzis shekel. You wouldn't want to, think that you're offering a machatzis shekel and you end up offering less, donating less than you are meant to be offering, donating. So what you do is you add this little shtickle to your machatzis shekel to make sure that you're offering at least a machatzis shekel. And that shtickle, that extra shtickle, would also go into, right, as I mentioned earlier, of the 7 pushkes on Har HaBayis, right? There were 7 and there were 6. 6 were for the nedavah, then there were these other 7. We mentioned that one was for the nests of people needing to offer birds, but another one was for tiklin chadtin, for this year's machzis a shekel. So you put into this year's machzis a shekel pushke, your machzis a shekel, along with the korban, along with the extra shtickle, and that's okay. Even though it's like kind of this extra thing that you're adding on to the machzis a shekel, it's okay. Now what happens if Reuven and Shimon, what if Reuven says to Shimon, hey Shimon, I've got a whole shekel here, not a half shekel, I got a whole shekel. Why don't I just put this shekel into the pushke for the both of us? So if Reuven is now putting in a shekel into the pushke for him and for Shimon, and sure, he's adding a little bit extra just to make sure that it's not less than a shekel, whatever, but he's not doubling the shtickle, it's a single shtickle. So whether you're bringing a machzis a shekel or whether you're putting into the pushke a whole shekel for 2 people, that extra shtickle, just to be safe, is going to be the same extra shtickle, whether it's a half shekel or a whole shekel, which means that if a lot of people are putting in a whole shekel for another person as well, then ultimately the lishka, right, the collection is, all those little shtickles are going to add up, right? So if everybody is just donating a machzis a shekel, so let's say there's 1 million people donating a machzis a shekel, so you're getting 1 million shtiklach. But let's say everyone's partnering, so you're losing half of the shtiklach. So therefore, even if you partner with somebody else and donate a whole shekel, you would still donate separately that extra shtickle that you didn't, that you missed from, that you would have had if there were separate machzis of shekels, and you put that into a dedicated, a bespoke pushke, just for that, what we're calling here ma'ah, for that extra shtickle, that would have its own bespoke, dedicated pushke. We don't want that extra shtickle that's just coming as an extra shtickle, not connected to any specific machzis a shekel. We don't want to be putting that into the machzis a shekel pushke, because it's the first shtickle, if you're offering a machzis shekel with an extra shtickle, okay, it can go in there. But when you're just offering it separately to make up for the fact that you joined together with somebody else, so all those separate shticklach would have its own bespoke pushke on harabayis, and that was the ma'ah pushke. Wow. Okay, we just got through a batch of 4 suggestions for what these 6 pushkes were all about. I'm going to chop a shluck of tea, and then we're going to go weiter. Now, Kulu ki Chizkiya lo amri, we saw 4 opinions. Chizkiya, Rabbi Yochanan, Zeiri, and Bar Pada. So none of them held like Chizkiya. Chizkiya had said that it was for all the Batei Avos, that they would be shalom. So everyone's getting the hides. Lo amri, they didn't say like him. Ansui lo chashinon tichochad v'chad yomei ka'avid. No, nobody was fighting. Everybody had their day that they worked, and they got whatever they got. Sundays, Beisav, they had plenty of work to do, and they are just fine. They're happy. They got whatever hides they got. What does Rashi say? V'im ba'u lo korbanos arbesh lo zarek l'shofar ein lo lito klum ba'orish. Okay, fine. Okay, now weiter. Rabbi Yochanan lo amri, and they don't all like Rabbi Yochanan about the coins getting moldy. Apushe lo chashinan. We're not too concerned. If the only issue was that if you add a lot of coins in one pushke, they can get moldy. They're not super concerned about that. Because the Zeiri lo amri, they don't say like Zeiri, who said about the donations. If you donated a cow, you don't bring an actual cow. You just put money in the pushke. Well, Zeiri was kind of dependent on Rebbe's opinion, right? He said that the reason why you have separate pushkas for a cow, for a calf, for a ram, for a younger sheep, for a big goat, for a small goat, is because if you committed to a small goat, you can't bring a big goat. You have to bring a small goat. But that's the opinion that we saw the other day. That's specifically Rebbe's opinion. So that relies on a das yachid. So they didn't want to rely on a das yachid. And kibar pada nami lo amri, they do not say like Bar Pada, because Mosaros Kulu Nami Mosaros, because on Bar Pada's list was the Mosaros, right? That if you had extra money from purchasing like an ashram or something, so it would go in the mosaros. But you don't need a dedicated, well, not necessarily, meaning having a pushka just for mosaros. I mean, the chatas and the ashrams are also mosaros, right? It's talking about a situation. A pile and nedavah shel tzibur. You set aside a cow for pile and nedavah shel tzibur. It got lost, so you offered a different one. Now you found the original one. It's extra. You don't. It's mosaros. It's extra. You already offered the original one, right? So therefore, those are all kilu. They're all basically mosaros. So you don't really need a separate mosaros one. All the other ones that got lost and replaced, whatever, those are also mosaros. And ve'ama'a, where are we? So kulu nami mosaros and ma'a. And the thing is, for that extra shtickle, lishkalim azla. According to them, they would disagree. I was explaining, according to Barpada, that he says that the extra shticklich for when two people join together for a shekel, so that extra shticklich they would have their own dedicated pushke. But the other opinions, Rabbi Yochanan, Chizkiah, Zeiri, would disagree and say that those shtiklach don't need their own dedicated pushka. They can just go into the machatzis hashekel pushkas. Designating within a brisa leichan kalbon zeolech. Where does the extra shtiklach go? Lishkal and divrei meir. According to Meir, they could just be treated like the rest of the machatzis hashekels. Rab Eliezer or Rab Elazar omer lenedavah. Rab Elazar says that it's a nedavah, and therefore Bar Pada would say like that, and that's why it gets its own bespoke pushke. But the others would disagree. They would say, like Reb Meir, that it could be treated, these extra shtiklach could just be treated like the rest of the machatzis hashekels and can just go into the machatzis hashekel pushke. Now we're going to get to a machlokas between Shmuel and Reb Oshaya about their opinions about what the 6 pushkes were, these nedavah pushkes were all about. Shmuel Amar says, Shmuel, kineged moser chatos umoser asham umoser asham nazar mosham asham mitzara, that if somebody had, let's say, set aside 3,000 shekels for a korban chatas, for a sheep, for a korban chatas, and he got a bargain, 2,500 shekels, so he's got the extra 500 shekels, he puts it in the moser chatas pushke. If he had set aside money for an asham, and he had extra money from that, asham gzelos, asham ilos, it would go into the moser asham pushke, umoser asham nazir. If by an asham nazir he had extra money, it would go into that pushke, umoser asham mitzara. And if there was extra money from his purchase of an asham mitzara, it would go into that pushke. Next, umoser minchas chote, and also a dedicated pushke for money. If there was money set aside to purchase flour for a minchas chote, and there was change, so that would go into the minchas chote pushke. And finally, and here's the controversial one, here's where Rabbi Oshai is going to disagree, was umosa asir sa'efa shel kohen gadol. Says Shmuel that the kohen gadol, of course, every day would bring a minchas chabitin, and if he had brought more, extra money, more money than he needed for the flour, so that extra money would go into that bespoke pushke. Now, Rabbi Oshaya largely agrees with Shmuel. He disagrees with the minchas chavitin pushke. Rabbi Oshaya Omar kineged moser chatas, moser asham nazir, moser asham mitzara. So far he agrees with Shmuel, and he adds umoser kinin, and then he says umoser minchas chote. So he agrees with minchas chote as well. So 5 out of 6 are correct, but according to Rabbi Oshaya, there was a dedicated pushke for moser kinin. If let's just use the example of Yoledes, a woman was going to bring a chatos and an ola of birds, and she had brought a certain amount of money, and there was left over, so it would go into that dedicated pushke. Ushmuel my time lo amar ki Rabbi Oshaya. Why does Shmuel disagree with Rabbi Oshaya? Well, kinin tana le reisha. Well, because kinin were in the first 7, right? 7 of the 7 pushkes that are not the nedavah pushkes, the first 7 pushkes, there was already one for nests. Rabbi Oshaya tani velo tani kinin. Well, Rabbi Oshaya has his 13 without that, so he leaves out the nests in the first 7. Tani Rabbi Oshaya v'tani kinin. 1 second, Rabbi Oshaya doesn't leave out the net. Rabbi Oshaya also has the nests in the first 7. However, chad lekinin v'chad lemoser kinin, but they're very different. However, their purposes are very different. The kinin in the first 7 or you put money into the pushke so that, and then that money will be used to buy, or the Kohen will basically empty out that money and then use that to offer birds for people who need to offer birds. Basically, the purpose of that one was that, if a person needs to offer a nest, so they put money in there for a nest, and they can rest assured that their nest got offered. So it's that money is used for actually offering chatas and olas. The money for the kinin of the 6 nedavas is very different. It's that if there was extra money from having purchased the nest, right, let's say whatever you brought, whatever, there was change, so you put that into the kinim nedava one, and then that's used to buy an olas kayetz mizbeach. Very different, not the birds. So it served different purpose. One was to actually purchase the birds. The other one was that if there's extra money, then there was a dedicated pushke for that to then buy olas kayetz mizbeachs with it. Rabbi Shai, my time lo amar kishmuel. Rabbi Shai does not say like Shmuel that the leftovers of the minchas chavitin of the Kohen Gadol would have its own pushke. Sovela commando Omar Mosar Shel Asir Se'evish Kohen Gadol Yirkov. Well, Rabbi Shai holds like the opinion who says that the leftovers, when it comes to the change for the minchas chavitin of the Kohen Gadol, you would just let it. You wouldn't do anything with it. You wouldn't do anything with it. It wouldn't be offered for nedavah. You just let it rot. You wouldn't do anything with it. Tasani is, we learn in the brisa, moser minchas nedavah, moser mincha yirkov. My comment, what does that mean? Moser minchas, what does it mean? This is of Chizda. This is what it means. Moser minchas chote nedavah, that any change, any leftover from purchasing a minchas nedavah, so then, wait, what? Anything, a minchas chote, if a person has been korban ola v'yored, brings flour, brings minchas chote, any leftover change, that would be for nedavah, would be for olas kayetz mizbeach. Most asir se'efa shel kohen gadol yirkov, but any leftovers from the asir se'efa of the kohen gadol would just be left to rot. It wouldn't be used for a nedavah. So Rabbi Oshaya holds like that opinion. And when we say that the leftover money, the change from the minchas chavit and the kohen gadol would be left to rot, I mean, we're talking about money, but I think the point is that just it would be unusable. The equivalent of like throwing it into the Dead Sea or whatever. It would just be forfeited. Rabba Omar says, Rabba afilu mosa asir se'efa shekohen gadol nami nedava. Whereas Rabba says, no, that even the most of the sir se'efa of the kohen gadol would be a nedava, would go towards the kayetz mizbeach, which is like Shmuel is saying, Ela mosar lach mitoda yirkav, just that the moser of life, if you set aside money to buy breads for a korban toda, those are what is going, if there's left over there, it's going to be let to rot. Biplukta, and it's like a machlokes, also between Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar, asir se'efa shel kohen gadol, Rabbi Yochanan Amar nedava. When it comes to the moser asir se'efa shel kohen gadol, Rabbi Yochanan Amar nedava. Rabbi Yochanan says that the leftovers are nedava, like Rabba's saying, like Shmuel is saying, Rabbi Elazar Amar Yirkov, Rabbi Elazar says it rots, like Rav Chizda is saying, like Rabbi Oshaya is saying. Meisvei, we have a contradiction. This is a Mishnah in Masechta Shkalim that says Moser Shkalim. I believe what this means is that if somebody, let's say a poor person, and this person knows that they're going to have to offer a machzis a shekel, so they are collecting money. They collect a whole bunch of money so that they will have money for the machzis a shekel, and it turns out that they collected more than they needed for the machzis shekel. Chulin, that extra is chulin. It's actually a machlokas between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel in the Mishnayos Masechta Shkalim. This is the opinion of Beis Hillel. Umosa asiris efa, and any leftover funds from the asiris efa. The question is, what's this asiris efa? We're assuming for now that it's asiris efa of the kohen gadol. Umosa kinei zavin v'kinei zavos, a zavin a zava, as we learned at the end of, I believe it was Parshas Mitzara, that once they are no longer a zav and a zava, they bring a chatas and an ola birds. Kine zavim v'kine zavis v'kine yoldos, and as we've been talking about, a woman after she gives birth, after 40 days for a boy, 80 days for a girl, also brings, depending on what she can afford, a nest of chatas and ola. V'chatos ve'ashamos Umoso, right, and also chatas is and ashams is Moser saying they're extra funds, nedavah. In all those cases, they're nedavah. So we had included in that list was Moser Asir Sa'efa. My lab, Moser Asir Sa'efa Shekoin Gadol. Is it not saying the leftovers of the Asir Sa'efa, of the Minchas Chavitin of the Kohen Gadol, and we're saying that it's a nedavah. So it's a kasha on Rabbi Shai. Lo, Moser Minchas Chote. No, the mincha that we're talking about is the Asir Sa'efa of a Minchas Chote. And that, if that's extra, yes, it's a nedavah. But we could say that by the Minchas Chavitin, it would be Yirkov, potentially. Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, so Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, Mistafer Commander Amar, Moser, Asir, Ephod, Shakoin Gadol, Yirkov. Says Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, they have a brisa in support of Rav Oshaya. Desanya, we learn a brisa, Lo Yosem Alei Hashemen, V'litin Alei Levona, Ki Chatos, he. It says by the Minchas Chote, no oil, no frankincense, because it is a chatos. Yehuda says, Yehuda, he kruya chatos, it. The minchas chote is a chatos, ve'ein acheres kruya chatos. No other mincha would be called a chatos. Limed al asir se'efesh kohen gadol, which therefore means that asir se'efesh of a kohen gadol she'ena kruya chatos is not a chatos, v'tuna levona, and it does require levona. U'mide'ena kruya chatos, Mosara yi rukav, and therefore, since it does not, it would not, the minchas chavitin would not be considered a korban chatos. So then it would, its extras would be left to rot, like Rav Oshaya was saying. Okay, and with that we wrap up the lengthy discussion of the 6 donation shofars on the Temple Mount. Friends, and now we get up to a new Mishnah that discusses options when a nedavah becomes blemished. So, Chaver, again, what is the difference between a neder and a nedavah? The first Mishnah in Masechta Kinim tells us that neder is a omer arei olai and nedavah is a omer arei zeh or zo or something like that. That the difference is by a neder, and of course the Mishnah Masechta Megillah, that ein bein, right, nedarim and nedavos, except for achrayis. That by a neder, you're chay ba'achrayis, that if you say, I am going to bring a korban ola, and you set aside Ruvain, the sheep, as a korban ola, and then Ruvain dies. Well, you haven't brought a korban ola yet, so you have to bring Shimon instead. Until you do what you said you were going to do, which is bring a korban ola. However, if you said Ruvain the sheep is going to be a korban ola and Ruvain the sheep dies, well, we missed our chance. Ruvain the sheep is dead, and with him died the obligation. There is no obligation to follow up with Shimon. Shimon was not included, only Ruvain was. So now, shor ze ola vinistoiv, if a person says that this shore, Ruvain the shore, Ruvain the ox, is going to be a korban ola, v'nistoiv, and it got a mum. So if it has a mum, you don't need to offer it. Okay? And now, imratza yavi b'dam of shnayim. Okay, so if you want to, you can bring 2 oxes instead. First of all, I think if you want to, you don't have to. If you don't want to, you don't have to bring anything at all, I think. But okay, if instead you want to say, okay, Ruvain the ox got a mum, so I'm going to bring a replacement. You can even bring two cows instead. Shnei shvarim elu olaf. He said that Reuven and Shimon, the oxen, are going to be olas. V'nistayvin, they both got mums. Rotz yavid ben echad. Right? Instead, you could bring 1 ox instead. V'Rebbe oser. Rebbe says, at least lichatchila, you can't do it. Again, we're talking about nedavah. I mean, you don't. It's not like you have a chrayis, it's not like you have an obligation anymore, but we're talking about the chatchila. I guess the point being, if it's keilu, you're bringing it instead. So Rebbe, who's more right, we had a Mishnah, maybe it was even last Mishnah, or the Mishnah, I think it may have been last Mishnah, that if you say you're going to bring a big korban, you're not allowed to bring a small korban. If you say you're going to bring a small korban, the Chacham say you could bring a bigger one. Rebbe says you can't. So there were questions about replacement korbans and the rules around that. Now here, because it's in a nedavah, technically you wouldn't have to bring anything at all. But since it's ke'ilu, you are bringing it instead of it pre-existing ones. So the Chacham are more lenient, but Rebbe is still kind of more stringent. But even b'diavad, I think Rebbe would say it's okay because you're not bringing it for any kind of obligation. Ayil zeh ola v'nista'iv. If you say that this ram is going to be a korban ola, v'nista'iv, but it got a mum. Im yirtza yavi b'dam of kevis. Okay, if you want, instead you could bring a sheep. Kevis zeh ola v'nista'iv v'yirtza yavi b'dam of ayil. And if you say, and if this sheep, you said this sheep is going to be an ola, and it got a mum, so you sold it, and now you have the money, and you want to bring with that money a ram, that is acceptable. Okay, gewaldig. Amazing. Now, Rebbe Oser, but Rebbe once again says that he would rather see it not happening. Says the Gemara, so in fact the Gemara, 1 second. Let me even just read the answer first, just in case nobody's confused by the question that doesn't make sense to them. Sure, zev v'nistayiv shiny. It's different when he's saying this ox, because it's essentially a nedavah, it's not a neder. So, what was the Gemara? We'll do it Jeopardy style. We'll start with the answer and we'll go back to the question. So what was the question? The question was, wait, but in last Mishnah we said, if a person says, I'm going to bring a ox for 100 zuzes, he can't bring 2 oxes, for 50 each or even 99 each. He's got to bring a ox for 100 zuzes. How over here are we saying that you could, if the ox gets a mum, you sell it and then with the money you buy 2 oxen? I thought we said we can't do that. Yeah, you can't do it when it is a neder, when you have an obligation, and when Reuven the ox got blemished, and now you can't offer it, but yet you still have to offer 100 zuz ox. So in that case, you still need to offer 100 zuz ox. You can't offer two for the price of 1. Here it's an nedavah. You said you're going to offer Reuven the ox. Reuven got a blemish. You're off the hook. If now you want to sell Reuven, take the money and buy, 2 for the price of 1, at this point it would be okay, because again, you have no obligation anymore. The obligation was what was tied to Reuven explicitly. Shnei shvarin elu olav v'nisayvu. Now, if he had said these 2 oxen are an ola and they both got mums, rotzayavi b'dmein echad. If you want, you could sell them and take the money and bring 1 ox. Rebbe Oser, Rebbe says no. My time up. Why does Rebbe? Okay, fine. So I believe, why does Rebbe say no? So mishum da'avale gadol vehevi kain. Because it's a scenario of gadol vehevi kain. We learned in the previous Mishnah that according to everybody, if you said you're going to bring a big animal, so you're not allowed to bring a smaller one. So here in this case, he said that these 2 animals, so 2 is considered better than 1. So therefore, if you said these 2 animals, I'm going to bring, these 2 oxen are going to be olas, and they got mums, you can't instead bring just 1 ox. So again, my time, how come Rebbe says no? Mishum da'avale gadol ve'evi kain, because it's a scenario of 2, and now instead he's bringing only 1 of gadol ve'evi kain, which is not allowed. V'afagav d'nistoiv, l'chatchila lo shari Rebbe. And even though we're talking about a situation where they got mums and they were nedavahs to begin with, so technically he doesn't have to bring anything at all. But still, just like we had said in the previous Mishnah, that if somebody committed to bring a big animal, everyone agrees you're not allowed to bring a smaller animal. So therefore, in this case also, where you're selling them and using the money from the sale to buy a replacement korban, Rebbe would prefer to stick to the, to have a similar mahalach and say, if you had committed to 2, do not instead bring 1. V'liflog nami bereisha. So why does Rebbe only argue on the sefer? Why does the Mishnah had said if somebody commits to bringing 1 ox, right? Not that. No, if somebody said to Reuven the ox, I'm going to offer you as an ola. Reuven got a mum. So then, if you sell Reuven and use the money to buy 2 olas, so he said that that's fine. And Rebbe doesn't argue with that. When the Mishnah then continues and says that if he had said to Reuven and Shimon the ox, you're going to be olas, and they get mums, so they're sold, and instead he brings 1 ox instead, so he went downgraded kilu from 2 to 1, there Rebbe argues. But if at the end of the day, we're talking about where it was an nedavah and they got mums, so Rebbe's going to say, nishgeferlach, and even though it was 2 and now you bring 1, it's okay. So then certainly in the Reisha, when you start out with 1 and now you bring 2, shouldn't Rebbe say that that's okay as well? Wait, was it? Well, no, I'm sorry. No, that's not no, I'm sorry. Rebbe argued on the Seifa. Rebbe argued on the Seifa when it was 2 that he downgraded to 1, but the fact of the matter is, in the previous Mishnah, Rebbe had also argued, if you said you're going to bring a small one and instead he brought a big one, so Rebbe said that even though it's an upgrade still, Rebbe says if you said you're going to bring a small one, so then bring a small one. So Rebbe should also argue on the Reisha as well, that when you said to Ruvain the ox, you're going to be an Ola, Ruvain gets a mum, and instead you bring 2 instead, so then Rebbe should also argue there and say that you shouldn't be doing that. Just right, and even though it got a mum, but still, Rebbe would prefer to say that lichatchila you shouldn't do it. So Rebbe should argue on that as well. Just like in the previous Mishnah, he said if you commit it to a small one, you're not allowed to bring a big one. Sheesh, my brain is starting to, it's been a very involved daf. Got to push through the mush now. All right, we can push through the mush. No, so Rebbe should also argue in the Reisha. So the answer is Rebbe Akula Milsapalik. Rebbe, in fact, does even argue on the Reisha. He argues on the whole thing. When it's 1 ox that you now want to trade in, instead offer 2, or when it's 2 now that you want to instead offer 1. V'notulu l'rabbanan ademaski milsayu v'adu mipaligal ila alayu. Rebbe just politely waited until the Chachamim finished stating their opinion, and then he argued upon them. So he waited. The Chachamim said, if you designated Reuven the ox as an Ola and it gets a mum, you could then offer 2 instead. They also said if you designated Reuven and Shimon the ox as Olas and they got a mum, you can offer just 1 instead. He waited to that statement, and he says that I argue on all of it, even when it's 1 upgrading to 2. Teda, and I can prove this to you because what's the next section of the Mishnah? Tikatani ayil zeh, an ayil which is bigger, Ola v'nistoiv rotza yavi b'dam of keves. If it gets a mum and you sell it and use its money to buy a sheep which is smaller, or alternatively keves zeh Ola v'nistoiv rotza yavi b'dam of ayil, that if this sheep got a mum and you took the money and now you're going to bring a ram which is an upgrade, so we say that that's okay. Rebbe Oser, and Rebbe says Oser. So we see that Rebbe also does argue by the upgrade Shema Mina, so we see that Rebbe argues in both. So meaning, sheesh. In the first part, when it was talking about the oxen, the second case of the Reisha was talking about a downgrade from 2 oxen to 1, and Rebbe argues there to say that the downgrade is Osir Lechatchila. We said, well, if Rebbe argues there, shouldn't he also argue by the upgrade? Because after all, Rebbe also says the upgrade is Osir in the previous Mishnah, right? So we said, the truth is Rebbe argues on everything, and I'll prove it to you, because even if you say that he's arguing on just the second, on just the second part of the first part, i.e. the 2 oxen downgrade to 1, well, the fact of the matter is in the next part of the Mishnah starts with the downgrade, a ram to a sheep, but then it goes to an upgrade, sheep to a ram, and Rebbe argues on that. So you see that clearly he argues on both the downgrade and the upgrade. Oh boy, sheesh. 1 second, let me regroup because my brain is starting to fade a little bit. This is something else, this stuff. I had a feeling it was going to be, I could look at a daf and know how if it's going to be complicated or not. I looked at this. There were several indications that this was going to be a complicated one. What about from different types? So, for example, a cow to a ram, right? So what? Right? We were talking about if you add Ruvain the ox, and then instead you want to bring, Shimon and Levi the ox. What about? Can you go from Ruvain the ox to lambs? Tashma coming here. Shor ze Ola Reuven the ox. You are going to be an Ola v'nistayv, and it got a mum. Lo yavi b'damav ayil. Don't bring with. So if you sell Reuven the ox, do not bring with its money 1 ram. Maybe b'damav bezelim, but you can bring 2 rams. That would be okay. 1 ram would be a little bit too much of an exaggeration, going from an ox to 1 ram. But 2 rams could be okay. So, there was a sort of issue of kind of going too small, but there was no issue of sort of ox to ram, because as long as you bring 2 rams, it's okay. Rebbe also the fisha ein bila. Rebbe says it's not allowed, but he gives a specific reason that there's no bila. Bila means that when you bring 2 rams, you're also going to have to bring 2 separate minchas nesachims, and those minchas nesachims need to be offered separately. You can't mix them together into one minchas nesachim. So therefore, you're going from an ox which had 1 minchas nesachim to 2 rams which are going to have 2 minchas nesachims, and you can't mix them together, which means you're basically going from 1 to 2, and that's just that's not good. So shmamino. So we see that, but we see though that in principle though, we see for sure that according to the Tanna Kama, there's no issue of oxen to rams as long as it's 2 rams. And even according to Rebbe, the issue was not oxen to rams. The issue was 1 versus 2 menachos, but the ram thing, oxen to ram, didn't seem to be an issue for Rebbe. So apparently the oxen to ram thing, the mina lemina thing, is a non-issue. If that's the case, my area trey afiluchad nami, if there's no issue of the different types, why do the Chacham say that you have to bring 2 rams? Shouldn't 1 ram be okay? Because at the end of the day, when it gets a mum, right, in our Mishnah, for example, we were talking about when you have Reuven the ox gets a mum. When you have Reuven and Shimon the ox were set aside, and they get mums. So then the Chacham said you could bring Levi the ox. A downgrade from 2 to 1 seems to be a non-issue. So how come over here we're saying you can't offer a sheep instead, even though it's a downgrade? But who cares? The Mishnah wasn't concerned with downgrades. So 2 different opinions on what the rabbi's shita was. In our Mishnah, they have no issue with a downgrade from 2 to 1. Over here, though, we seem to have an issue with the downgrade from an ox to a sheep, but an ox to a ram. But 2 rams, though, would be okay. So we had 2 different versions of what the opinion of the rabbis was. Rabbi O said lefisha ein bila. Rabbi had said that an ox to 2 rams won't work only because you can't mix together the 2 menachos. Taima de ein bila. Okay, so the reason is because you can't mix together the 2 menachos, which means you can have 2 separate menachos. So you went from a cow which has 1 mincha to 2 rams which have 2 minchas, and that's a problem. Hayesh bila shari. So does that imply that if you could, that's the only issue is the bila, but if you could theoretically mix together the 2 menachos, then there would be no other issues? But we learned in our Mishnah, ayil ze ola, that if you say that this ram is an olive in a stove and it got a mum, ratza yavi b'dam of keves, according to Tanna Kama, you sell it and take the money and bring a sheep rather than a ram. Keves ze olive in a stove, yavi b'dam of ayil. And if the same thing happened in reverse, you had set aside a sheep, it got a mum, so then you sold it and used the money to buy a ram, it's okay. The Rebbe says it's also. So apparently, Rebbe does have an issue with different types. So we say similarly here, well, there's 2 opinions as to what Rebbe's shita actually was. In our Mishnah, he does take issue with different types, rams, sheep. However, according to opinion, it says that the only issue is bila. Well, then that's the only issue. So long as, if theoretically bila would be a non-issue, the types are a non-issue as well. Now, what happens? We've been talking about that the original animal got a mum. What if the original animal didn't get a mum? What if you said, Reuven, the ox, I'm going to offer you as a korban ola, and it never got blemished? So egel vevi par keves vevi ayil yatsa. Well, in that case, in the scenario where he says, I'm going to bring a calf, and instead he brings a full an adult cow. If he said he's going to bring a sheep and instead he brings a ram, yotza, that's fine because it's an upgrade, stomach rabbanon, and this brisa therefore is like the opinion of the rabbis in the Mishnah before this one, where they had said that a small one and in the end you upgrade it to a big one is fine. So we see here also a calf to a cow, a sheep to a ram, all good like the rabbis. Ratza yavi b'dam of beis v'chulei. We had said if one of the cows gets a mum and you sell it, you can, right? If you had said, Reuben the cow, I'm going to bring you as a Ola. It gets a mum, you sell it, and then use the money to buy two. That is okay. Amar Menachos bar Zvid, Amar Rav Loshanu Ela do Amar Shor Ze Ola. This is only when you say that this shore, Ruvain, the shore, you are in Ola. Aval, Amar Shor Ze Alai Ola. But if he says that Ruvain, the ox, you are upon me in Ola, Hukba, no, now it's established for Achrayas, that would be a neder, not a nedavah. V'dilma alai lahavio kamer. 1 second, what's the problem with alai? Maybe what he's saying is that Ruvain, the shore, you are upon me to offer you. I'm going to offer you as a korban ola, but he's not. The obligation remains the same, which is to offer Ruvain the ox. If Ruvain the ox dies, his obligation goes away, even though he said alai. So ela yidmar. Amar Menachos by Zvid Amar Rab Loshanu Ela do Amar Shor Ze Ola Inami Amar Shor Ze Olai Ola. Either lashon. If he says that Ruvain the cow is an Ola, or if he says Ruvain the cow is upon me to bring as an Ola, either way it's a nedavah, and there's no achrayis. Aval Amar Shor Ze Vidamav Olai Ola. If he says that this ox Ruvain and its value is upon me as an Ola, Hukba. Well, now he has achrayis, and if Ruvain gets a mum, so he will have to find a proper replacement, and he would have to bring another cow, wouldn't be able to bring a calf, etc. And finally, we get to a new Mishnah and the final segment of today's daf. Ha'omer echad mikvosai hektish. If a person says, I have a flock of sheep, one of my sheep is hektish. The echad mishvarai hektish, or one of my oxen is hektish. So the question is, which one? So if all he had was 2 sheep or 2 oxen, hagadol shaben hektish, it is the bigger one is going to be the hektish. So he has 2 sheep or 2 oxen. He says, I'm going to bring a sheep as an ola, or I'm going to bring one of my oxen as an ola. So it's the bigger one. Shlosha benoni shaben hektish. Now if he has 3 sheep or 3 oxen, it's the middle one that is hektish. Perashti v'eni yodea ma perashti. If he says, I had said specifically which of the sheep or oxen are going to be hektish, are going to be an ola, but I don't remember which one it is. Osho Amar li Abba, or my father before he died said to me, I had made one of my sheep or oxen in ola, v'eni yodea ma, but I don't know which one my father specified. He specified one, I just don't know which one. Hagodol shaben hektish. In those cases, when one specifically was specified and you just don't know which one it is, you bring for sure the biggest of them. Says the Gemara, from the fact that when there are 2, we say the bigger one is donated. So alma makdish ba'ayin yafeh makdish. So that means that a person who is being makdish something is being makdish ba'ayin yafeh, graciously, generously, and therefore we assume that it is the bigger one that is hektish. However, a masefa, then we say that when there's 3, Beinoni shaben hektish, that it's not the biggest of them that's hektish, but the middle one. Alma makdish ba'ayin ra'a makdish, that he's makdish with a bad eye. He doesn't want to with a stingy eye. He doesn't want to be makdish his best one. So Shmuel says, no, what it's saying is that we are concerned even for the middle one, because the legabe ka'in ayin yafeu, because the middle one, sure, in relation to the better one, it's worse, but in relation to the worst one, it's better. So therefore, we're concerned even for the possibility that the middle one is hektish. So what do you do? Yumam, wait for the middle one to get a mum, and then bimochel, transfer its kedusha onto the big one, and then offer the big one. And that way, if initially the kedusha was in fact chal on the big one, well, it was chal on the big one from the beginning. If it was in fact chal on the middle one, well, now you're transferring its kedusha onto the big one, and then you offer the big one. At the end of the day, you are going to end up offering the big one as the korban ola. Amar of Nachman, Amar Rabba bar Avua lo shanu elo de Amar echad mishvarai hektish. Now, when the Mishnah says that when he has 3 oxen and he says one of my oxen is hektish, so we say we're concerned that maybe the middle one could be hektish. Aval Amar shor bishvarai hektish, but if he says the ox of my oxen is hektish, hagadol shaben hektish, it is the biggest one. Torah b'torai k'amar, he's saying my best shor is hektish. So So echad mishvarai could be the middle one, but shor mishvarai, that's the best one. Ini is that's over. Amar Rav Huna bar Chia mishmei deula haomer lechaveru bayis bebeisai. That one of my houses, ani mocher lecha, I'm selling to you. Ma'eu aliyah. So what does he say? Oh yeah, here's the attic. I said just one of my houses. I was referring to the attic, the worst one. La mishum degriya. We're not saying that, right? I mean, when he says buy, I don't know what I just said. When he says bayis bebeisai, a house among my homes, and he just shows him the attic. That's the worst one. But based on what we said, shor mishvarai, that's the best one. So lo me'ula shabatim. No. Fakir. We say, but aliyah doesn't mean the attic, it means the best. So if it says, a house among my homes I'm selling to you, it means he's selling him the best house. Basically, we have a contradiction. Shor b'shvarai hektish. If a person says, an ox among my oxen is hektish, which we would assume means the best one. V'chein shor shel hektish in his ba'acherim, and also a shor of hektish that was an ola got mixed up with other oxen. Hagadol sheben hektish. So the best of them is hektish. V'chulam. Now, what happens to the rest of them? Yimachu letzorke olas. You sell them to people looking to offer olas. V'dmei and chulin. And since ultimately all of them are going to be offered as olas, the money that is received for them is chulin. So we see that it's not just the best one. All of them are going to be offered as olas, right? So meaning, we had said, for example, if a korban ola gets mixed together among a whole bunch of animals, so what you do is you take the best one, offer it as your ola, and the rest of them sell to people looking for olas, but we don't just say that the rest of them are chulin. And so we had said earlier that if a person says shor mishvara is hektish, so he's referring only to the best one, not to the other ones. And now over here we're saying that no, all of them you have to be concerned about, and you sell them for people looking for olas. So Targuma ashor shel hektish and isai b'chem. No. The whole thing about selling all of them, that's for when you have an ola that gets mixed together with all these other ones. So you take the best one, offer that as your ola, then sell the rest of them. But if we're just talking about that he has 3 oxen and it says shor mishvar, it's referring to the best one, not to the others. But it says v'chein shor shel hektish, etc. It sounds like they're both the same thing. It's both the same scenario, the same outcome. Tuguma agadol. No, on the fact that we're talking about the biggest one, meaning the fact that we're saying that when we say shor mishvara, it's referring to the biggest one, and the fact that when an ola gets mixed together with a whole bunch of animals, we say offer the best one, and then the rest are olas. So the fact, so they're the same in terms of that you're going to offer the best one, whether you said shor mishvarai or whether an ola got mixed together with other animals. In both cases, you're going to be offering the best one. They do differ in however, in that when you're saying shor mishvarai, only the best one is in ola, the rest of them are chulin. But by the other case, if an ola gets mixed together with the others, you offer the best one, but then the rest are suffek olas, and you have to sell them all to people who are looking to buy, looking to offer olas. And then the money, it becomes chulin, since the animals are ultimately going to be offered as olas. The money is chulin, right? Meaning, usually if you say I'm going to bring an ola, and then the animal gets a mum, right? You said I'm going to bring this sheep as an ola. Well, I'm going to bring an ola, and then you dedicate a sheep, designate a sheep. That sheep gets a mum, so it's no longer kadosh. So what happens to the kedusha? Well, you sell the animal, and now the money has the kedusha, and you buy a new animal. But in the case that we gave, you're selling them to people that are going to be offering them as olas, so the animals are kadosh, so the money is not kadosh, it is chulin. We have a contradiction. He says, a home among my homes I am selling to you, the nafal, and now one of his homes falls down. Mar'eu nafal, you could say, okay, I showed you, this is the house I sold to you, the one that fell down, i.e. his worst one. Eved ba'avoda ani mocher l'cha, a slave among my slaves I'm selling to you, umeis, and then one of his slaves dies. Mar'eu umeis, he says, okay, I sold you the dead one. Ve'amai lechze hai nafal, hai meis. 1 second. If what we said is shor mishvara means the best one, shouldn't we say that, well, he sold him his best house or his best eved, and we should see which one died. If the best one died, if the best one fell down, well, then he says, okay, here's the one that died, here's the one that fell, the house that fell down. But if the house that the best one is still standing, or the best eved is still alive, well, then he should get the best one, right? Shor, right? Shor mishorai, bayis mi beisai, eved mi avadai, should be the best. Lokeach ka'omat shani lokeach the yad bal ashtar la tachtonut. We say no, that this is different though, because here we're talking about a contract, a shtar, and we have a concept that Yad Bal Ashtar Al Tachtona, the person who has the document, he has the worst negotiating position, because it's as Rashi says, Amotzi Mechaver Olav Araya. Right? He shows up with his document and says, "Look, I bought one of your avodim," and the owner says, "Oh yeah, I sold you my worst one." Or no, I sold you my dead one. I sold you this one, the one that's dead. And he's now going to have to prove that no, he was sold one of the live ones. And if the document doesn't, show that, well, then he's in the lower negotiating position. Now that we've said this, well, then going back to Bayis Mi Beisai, and then he goes and says here's the aliyah. So we had said earlier that it's the attic, right? It's the worst one, even though he says Bayis Mi Beisai. We said no, aliyah means the best one. But now that we've said that the Yad Bal Ashtar Tachtona, that the person with the document has the worst the worse off negotiating position, well then in that case as well, in fact, the owner should be able to say, here's the attic, enjoy. Because we're talking about somebody who has a document. Wow, that was a very... Sorry, I rushed up at my apologies for rushing at the end, but I think I just needed to keep going. I think I got exhausted. I imagine I'm probably not the only one here who's exhausted. So I apologize for rushing at the end, but I think it was what kind of needed to be done here. Wow, okay. Masechta Menachos at the end of the Masechta, reminding us what Kodshim is all about and how intense and intricate Kodshim can be. We learned about the 6 shofars on the Temple Mount. We saw 6 opinions about the 6 shofars with 36 different possibilities, with some of them requiring quite a bit of explanation. I'm not going to go into all of them now, but we did see 6 different opinions on what the different shofars were on Har HaBayis that would be used, that the money in these pushkas would be used for the Olas Kayitz HaMizbeachs. We discussed options when a new Mishnah, that options when a nedavah becomes blemished. So if a person says that this animal, or even these animals, are going to be a korban, but it's a nedavah, which means that there's no achrayis. If you get a mum, you don't have to technically make a replacement. But if you are going to make a replacement, what are the possibilities and what are not? Generally, the Chachamim tended to say that you can, even you downgrade, upgrade, whatever, whereas Rebbe seemed to stick more towards his opinion from the previous Mishnah that you cannot upgrade or downgrade, even though he agrees that ultimately we're talking about lechatchila, because b'diavad it's in a nedavah where there's no achrayis, there's no chiyuv, there's no obligation anymore. And we got to a third Mishnah about designating an animal from a group of animals. Person says, I'm going to make one of my animals like this, so then it could even be the middle one potentially. But if he says an ox from among my oxen, a sheep from among my sheep, he's talking about the best one. But we said that applies to olas, to hektish, but when it comes to a document, if he says a house from among my homes, it does not necessarily refer to his best one, because we have a principle of yad bal ashtar tachtona. The person who has the document is inherently in the worse off negotiating position. He's going to have to prove his case. Friends, I hope you enjoyed the intensity of Daf Kufches and the time that we spent together learning the Rabbanu Shalom's Torah. Have a great day. I'll catch you tomorrow for Daf Kuftes of Masechta Menachos.